Dragon Orphanage knew no warmth, until a human engineer created something that changed everything. The winds of Vayara were cruel. They swept across the highlands with icy fingers, whistling through jagged cliffs and deep crevices. Even the strongest of creatures shivered under its touch. In the midst of these frozen mountains, an orphanage stood, not for humans, but for dragons. The stone walls, once vibrant with heat and life, were now gray and brittle. Smoke did not rise from chimneys, fire did not glow from hearths. The dragons inside huddled together, trembling, small and fragile in a world that had not been kind to them. The orphanage was not large. It consisted of several stone chambers, each carved into the mountainside, connected by narrow tunnels. Within these chambers lay dozens of dragon hatchlings, their scales dull from cold and their eyes wide with unease. They could not yet produce strong flames to warm themselves, and the caretaker systems, old mechanical drones, had long since begun to fail. Rusted gears squeaked in the corners, their movements slow and uncertain. The hatchlings had no one to guide them, no one to teach them the ways of survival in a harsh world. Among them was a small hatchling named Cinder. His scales were a muted red, almost blending into the cold stone. He shivered constantly, wrapping his tiny wings around himself like a blanket. His eyes were bright, full of fear but also curiosity. Cinder had been born just weeks before, and like the others, he had never felt warmth beyond the cold stone walls and the failing hum of the caretaker drones. Every day was a struggle for survival, every night a battle against despair. The orphanage had been abandoned by humans decades ago. Once, settlers of Vayara had attempted to raise dragons, believing that the creatures, fire, could aid in energy production. But harsh winters, supply shortages, and the difficulty of nurturing such unique beings forced the settlers to leave. Only the mechanical drones remained, carrying out their programmed duties with dwindling efficiency. Feeding was sporadic, heating was irregular. For the dragons, life had become a monotonous fight against cold and hunger. But hope, as fragile as it might seem, arrived in the form of a shuttle crashing against the mountainside. The vessel's descent was violent, snow and ice exploding around it, leaving a trail of sparks and smoke. From the wreckage emerged a human figure, clothed in insulated engineering armor and a visor fogged with frost. Her name was Alara Voss, a young human engineer sent by the Interstellar Council to survey nearby geothermal energy sources. She had never planned to meet dragons, and certainly not in such dire circumstances. But fate had other plans. Alara staggered through the snow, using the shuttle's wreckage for support. Her scanners, designed to detect energy readings, picked up an unusual thermal signature within the stone cliffs. It was faint but unmistakable, biological warmth, struggling against the harsh cold. Curious and slightly alarmed, she followed the readings to the source. The entrance to the orphanage loomed before her, a dark opening in the mountainside. Inside, the sight that greeted her was astonishing. Hatchlings of various sizes and colors stared at her with wide, wary eyes. Some had bluish scales, others green, and a few were red like embers. They trembled not from fear alone, but from the bitter cold that seeped through the stone walls. Their small tails curled around their bodies, wings tucked tightly, claws clutching the floor as if the stone itself could comfort them. Alara froze for a moment, unsure whether to approach. Her heart pounded as she realized the creatures were intelligent. They were watching her, judging her. She took a cautious step forward. One of the hatchlings, a tiny blue one with silvery eyes, hissed softly and recoiled. The others followed, some curling together for warmth, others flattening against the floor. Alara knelt carefully, keeping her hands visible. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said softly, her voice muffled by her visor. The words seemed to matter more than she expected. Cinder, the red hatchling, inched closer, curious yet cautious. Alara understood quickly that warmth alone would not earn their trust. These dragons had known cold all their lives. Their instincts were weak, their flames unreliable. She had seen countless species in her time as an engineer, but never anything like this. Each step she took required patience and care. She pulled small thermal sensors from her pack, placing them around the room to measure ambient temperature. The readings were dismal. The chambers hovered barely above freezing. Without intervention, survival would be impossible. Determined, she began working. She found the old geothermal pipes running through the stone walls, corroded but mostly intact. Using spare parts from her shuttle and her engineering tools, she patched leaks, rerouted flows, and connected a series of heating panels to the existing pipes. Steam hissed and warmth began to spread, slow but noticeable. The hatchlings, sensing heat, shivered less and looked around in confusion. Some crept closer, as if drawn by a faint memory of comfort. Cinder was the first to approach fully. Tentatively, he tapped her hand with his snout, releasing a tiny wisp of flame, small enough to be harmless but enough to signal trust. Ilara smiled behind her visor, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. If one hatchling could begin to trust her, perhaps all of them could. But warmth alone was not enough. She observed the hatchlings over several hours, noting their patterns. They reacted to movement, sound, and touch, but most importantly, to attention. They needed interaction, stimulation, and something to occupy their minds. Ilara rummaged through her shuttle supplies and found old mechanical parts, gears, and small circuit boards. She crafted tiny devices that could move and rattle, small puzzle feeders, and even simple mechanical toys. When she placed these in the chambers, the dragon's curiosity grew. They approached cautiously, tapping and nudging the devices. Each small success reinforced her determination. By the second day, the hatchlings were exploring the chambers more freely, their eyes brightening with each new discovery. Cinder became her guide, showing the others that this human was not a threat. He would nudge her hand, hiss softly, and breathe controlled flames, signaling approval. Slowly, trust was forming, not just between human and dragon, but among the hatchlings themselves. Ilara realized that survival depended on more than heat. It depended on connection. She began designing a device she called the Ember Core, a mechanical hearth that could radiate warmth while responding to the proximity and movements of the dragons. It would sense their presence, adjust heat automatically, and provide a gentle glow that reminded them of the warmth of companionship. It was ambitious, but she had no other choice. By nightfall, the first prototype was ready. She activated it carefully. A gentle hum filled the chamber, followed by a soft golden glow. Warmth spread evenly, and the hatchlings stirred, some curling closer, others stretching their wings slightly. Cinder walked up to the Ember Core and breathed a controlled wisp of flame into its sensors. The core pulsed in response, glowing brighter for a moment before settling into a steady rhythm. The dragons hissed in surprise, then grew calm. They had never felt anything like this before. Ilara watched, exhausted but elated. For the first time, the orphanage felt alive. The walls no longer seemed like a prison but a haven. The dragons were still small, still vulnerable, but now they had hope. And in hope there was strength. As she sat among the hatchlings, her mind turned to the future. She knew the Ember Core was only the beginning. These dragons would need more teaching, guidance, protection. She would have to innovate, adapt, and learn as much from them as they would from her. But for now, she allowed herself a quiet moment of satisfaction. She had brought warmth to a place that knew only cold, and in doing so, had taken the first step toward something extraordinary. Outside, the winds of Veera continued to howl, but inside, the dragons huddled in the newfound warmth, eyes wide, bodies relaxed, and hearts just beginning to trust. And Ilara, a human engineer in a world that had forgotten its dragons, smiled as she realized that survival was no longer just a possibility, it was a promise. Hook for Part 2. The Ember Core had worked, but the dragon's reaction had been stronger than expected. Something deeper, more instinctive had awakened. And as Ilara would soon discover, warmth alone would not be enough to prepare them for the challenges that awaited. The first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the stone walls, casting pale golden streaks over the orphanage. The dragons stirred, their small bodies curling and uncurling as they tested the new warmth Ilara had brought into their lives. Even the coldest corners of the chamber seemed less threatening now, the bitter wind outside no longer dominating their senses. Cinder, the red hatchling, moved carefully toward the Ember Core, his tiny claws clicking on the stone floor. The glow pulsed softly as he approached, and he breathed a cautious wisp of flame into its sensors. The warmth flickered, responding to his touch, and a low hum filled the chamber. Ilara watched silently from her spot near the entrance. She had slept little since her crash landing, but her exhaustion was a small price to pay for this moment. The Ember Core was more than a source of heat. It was a bridge between human and dragon, a promise of safety in a world that had long offered them none. She knew, however, that warmth alone would not be enough. These dragons were intelligent creatures, with instincts and emotions she could only begin to understand. They needed more than fire, they needed trust. For the next several hours, she observed their behavior. Some hatchlings were still wary, shrinking back when she moved, while others, like Cinder, began to follow her carefully with their eyes, mirroring her movements. She noted patterns, how they responded to sound, to gestures, and to her calm presence. The more she learned, the more she realized that the dragons were curious by nature. Curiosity, she decided, would be her key. Alara began to improvise. Using scraps from her shuttle and remnants of old caretaker drones, she crafted small mechanical toys. Tiny wheels with bells, moving rods, and flickering lights filled the chamber. She placed them near the hatchlings and waited. At first, the dragons hesitated. Their instincts told them these objects were strange and possibly dangerous. But Cinder, ever bold, nudged a moving rod with his snout. The rod spun, jingling softly, and he recoiled in surprise. But then he tried again. Soon the other hatchlings approached, poking, nudging, and tapping. A soft chorus of hisses and curious chirps filled the room. Alara smiled, realizing that the dragons were not only learning, they were experimenting. Their intelligence shone through as they tested cause and effect, understanding that their actions could change the environment around them. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of hope that these hatchlings could survive and even thrive. The progress, however, was fragile. A gust of wind rattled the stone walls, and the hatchlings froze, curling into themselves. Fear still dominated much of their behavior, and Alara knew that trust would not come overnight. She began spending more time in the chambers, moving slowly, speaking softly, and offering gentle gestures. She learned to anticipate their reactions, extending her hand only when they were ready. Slowly, carefully, they began to mirror her trust. Cinder became her guide, teaching the others that she was not a threat. He would nudge her, hiss softly, and breathe controlled flames, testing her response. Each interaction deepened their bond. Alara began to notice something remarkable. The hatchlings were learning not just from her, but from each other. When one discovered a toy or puzzle, the others quickly observed and attempted the same actions. The orphanage was becoming a small ecosystem of learning and cooperation. Alara realized that the Ember Core could do more than provide warmth. She began to experiment with its functions, adding sensors that responded not only to proximity, but to emotional signals. If a hatchling approached with hesitation, the Ember Core would glow more brightly and emit a gentle pulse of heat, encouraging them forward. If a dragon displayed agitation, the device would dim and release a soft, comforting hum. The Ember Core became not just a hearth, but a companion, responding to the dragon's moods and needs. The hatchlings responded in ways she had not anticipated. Cinder and a small green hatchling, whom she named Verdant, began to interact directly with the Ember Core, nudging it, breathing fire near its sensors, and observing the changes. They discovered that the device could be manipulated, and in doing so, they experienced a sense of control they had never known. The room filled with the soft flicker of flames, the hum of the Ember Core, and the small chorus of dragon chirps and hisses. As the days passed, the dragons' movements became more confident. They explored the chambers, tested their wings, and began to play with each other. Alara introduced simple challenges, hiding small bits of food in mechanical puzzle feeders. The hatchlings discovered that they could manipulate levers and rotate gears to release treats. Each success brought bursts of energy and excitement, their chirps growing louder and more joyful. They were learning cooperation, problem-solving, and patience. Alara watched them carefully. She was not only an engineer but a teacher, and she realized the importance of patience and consistency. Every failed attempt by the hatchlings was met with calm guidance. She never punished, never shouted. Her presence itself became a lesson. Gradually, the hatchlings began to associate her voice, her gestures, and even the warmth of her hands with safety and comfort. But trust was not built only on warmth and play. It was also forged through shared experience. One night, a minor tremor shook the highlands, dislodging a rock from the ceiling of one chamber. The hatchlings panicked, scattering and shrieking in fear. Alara moved quickly, guiding them to a safer area, using the Ember Core's heat to calm them. She spoke in soft tones, and Cinder responded first, nudging the core and signaling the others to follow. In that moment, the dragons learned something profound. This human could protect them. The bond between Alara and the dragons grew stronger each day. She began to understand their individual personalities. Cinder was bold and curious, often testing the boundaries of safety. Verdant was cautious, observing carefully before acting. Others had their own quirks. One hatchling loved warmth above all else, often curling around the ember core for hours, while another was playful and mischievous, nudging objects to see how they moved. Alara recorded their behaviors, learning patterns that would help her guide them more effectively. One evening, as the sun set behind the frozen peaks, the chamber glowed warmly. The dragons gathered around the ember core, some resting, others exploring. Alara sat among them, exhausted but content. She realized that survival was no longer a distant goal. They were thriving in small, meaningful ways. The ember core had done more than provide heat. It had sparked trust, curiosity, and the beginnings of intelligence that could grow with guidance. Yet, Alara knew their journey was only beginning. These hatchlings were still vulnerable. The highlands were dangerous, and predators roamed nearby. The ember core could protect them from the cold, but it could not shield them from all threats. She needed to think beyond warmth, to imagine ways in which these dragons could defend themselves, cooperate, and eventually grow strong enough to face the wider world. She began sketching ideas on her datapad, drawing circuits, tunnels, and mechanical enhancements. The dragons watched her curiously, some tapping her tools, nudging at the drawings. She smiled. They were learning from her as much as she was learning from them. Every glance, every gesture, every cautious step forward was a lesson in trust and cooperation. By the time night fully settled over Vayara, the orphanage was alive with movement and quiet energy. The ember core hummed softly, radiating warmth, while the hatchlings played, explored, and rested. For the first time in decades, the orphanage felt like a home, a place of safety, learning, and life. Alara lay down near the ember core, her eyes heavy but her heart light. She knew tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and perhaps new dangers. But for now, the orphanage had taken its first steps into a brighter future. The dragons had discovered warmth, companionship, and the beginnings of trust. And in doing so, they had awakened a spark of hope that could never be extinguished. High above, the winds of Vayara continued to howl, cold and relentless. But inside the stone walls, the hatchlings huddled, curious and alive. The ember core pulsed gently, a heartbeat of warmth and life. And somewhere in the cold night, a human engineer smiled, knowing that the smallest spark could grow into a flame capable of changing everything. Hook for Part 3. The ember core had awakened something deep within the dragons, a primal instinct, a curiosity, and an intelligence that could grow beyond anything Alara had imagined. But with awakening came risk, and soon the hatchlings would face challenges far greater than the cold of Vayara. The ember core pulsed softly in the dim light of the stone chamber, casting shadows across the curious faces of the dragon hatchlings. They had grown accustomed to its warmth, and now, days after its activation, something extraordinary began to happen. Flames flickered in the snouts of a few hatchlings, not the weak, hesitant sparks they had once struggled to produce, but controlled, glowing embers. Cinder, the red hatchling, was the first. He lifted his tiny head, inhaled deeply, and exhaled a small, steady flame into the air. The glow reflected in his eyes, bright and alive. Alara watched in awe, her heart racing. She had expected the ember core to provide comfort, to give warmth and safety, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. The dragons were not only surviving, they were awakening. Their instincts, previously weak and fragile, were stirring with life. The controlled flames were a sign of growing confidence, curiosity, and intelligence. "Careful," she whispered, keeping her voice low. "It's okay, you can do this." Her hands moved slowly, signaling patience. She had learned over the past days that sudden movements could frighten them. But when Cinder looked at her and hesitated for only a moment before releasing another steady ember, she realized they were beginning to trust her fully. The other hatchlings watched closely. Verdant, the cautious green hatchling, leaned forward, eyes wide, trying to mimic Cinder's actions. At first, only tiny sparks appeared, sputtering uncertainly. But with each attempt, Verdant gained more control, and soon the chamber was illuminated by dozens of tiny, flickering flames. It was a mesmerizing sight, an orchestra of fire and life, delicate but brilliant against the cold, gray stone walls. Alara could feel the air shift. It was not just warmth that filled the chamber. It was energy, excitement, and the spark of intelligence. The dragons were learning quickly not just to produce flames, but to experiment with them. They nudged each other playfully, testing how far their embers could reach without causing harm. Some breathed near the ember core, watching it pulse and glow in response. They had discovered cause and effect, an understanding that their actions could change their environment. For Alara, this was a breakthrough. Her mission was no longer only about survival. It had become about teaching, guiding, and preparing these creatures for a world that could be as dangerous as it was beautiful. But with awakening came new risks. The dragon's flames, even small, could attract attention. Sparks of heat and light might reach predators or curious explorers in the highlands. She had to think ahead. The first warning came one evening when the hatchlings were practicing near the entrance. A shadow moved along the frozen cliffs, a small pack of frostclaws, predators that hunted the weak and unprotected. Alara froze, her heart pounding. The hatchlings sensed danger as well, their small bodies tensing, eyes darting toward the movement. "Stay calm," she whispered. "Trust me," the Ember Core responded. Its sensors detected agitation in the dragons and increased the heat output, sending gentle pulses that calmed them. Alara moved quickly, setting small traps she had improvised from parts of her shuttle. She arranged reflective panels to confuse the predators, directing the warmth and light in ways that made it appear the dragons were in multiple places at once. Cinder, understanding the pattern, began to react instinctively. He nudged Verdant toward a safer spot, and together they maneuvered the hatchlings into the protected center of the chamber. Alara guided them with soft gestures, her voice calm but firm. The Frostclaws approached, drawn by the heat and movement, but the combined effort of human ingenuity and dragon instinct turned the attack into a failure. The predators, confused and overwhelmed, retreated into the shadows, leaving the orphanage unharmed. The dragons did not merely survive, they had learned. In the span of a single encounter, they had begun to understand cooperation and strategy. Alara realized the magnitude of what she had witnessed. These hatchlings were intelligent, capable of observation, learning, and action. They were not passive creatures to be sheltered. They were beings who could grow, adapt, and even defend themselves. In the days that followed, Alara expanded their training. She introduced controlled exercises, encouraging the hatchlings to practice flame control on small, safe targets. They learned to direct their fire precisely, understanding both its power and its limitations. The Ember Core became an interactive guide, pulsing gently when they were successful, dimming when they misfired. It taught patience, timing, and focus. Cinder, ever the leader, thrived in this environment. He experimented not only with fire but with movement, learning to coordinate with Verdant and the others. They began to play small games, testing boundaries and responding to each other's actions. Laughter, or the dragon equivalent of it, filled the chambers. For the first time, the orphanage was alive with joy, curiosity, and energy. Alara took notes constantly, recording their behaviors, understanding their learning patterns, and adjusting her guidance. She realized that the dragon's intelligence was accelerating far faster than she had anticipated. With the Ember Core as a teacher and herself as a guide, these hatchlings were developing skills that could rival older, more experienced dragons. But the highlands of Vayara were not forgiving. The awakening of the dragons did not go unnoticed. From distant peaks, predators watched, scavengers prowled, and other creatures were drawn by the signs of life. Alara knew that the orphanage, while thriving, was still vulnerable. They were stronger, yes, but strength alone would not guarantee survival. She had to prepare them not only to control their flames, but to protect themselves from threats beyond the stone walls. One night, as snow fell softly outside, Alara gathered the hatchlings around the Ember Core. Its gentle warmth bathed the chamber in gold, and she spoke in calm, steady tones. "You are learning," she said. "You are growing, but the world is wide and dangerous. You must use your flames wisely, help each other, and trust what you have learned." The dragons listened, or at least appeared to. Cinder and Verdant nudged her gently, as if acknowledging her words. The other hatchlings chirped softly, curling closer to the warmth. There was understanding in their eyes, not the kind of understanding taught by instinct alone, but the beginning of reasoning, of awareness, of intelligence. Alara realized something profound. Humans had often been seen as the dominant species in the galaxy because of their ability to think, adapt, and create. Here, She was witnessing a spark of that same ingenuity in another species, nurtured by guidance, patience, and careful invention. The Ember Core was more than a machine. It was a bridge between species, a tool for teaching, for building trust, and for unlocking potential. As she watched the hatchlings settle for the night, she knew that the awakening of their flames was only the beginning. The Ember Core had sparked something deep within them: curiosity, intelligence, and the desire to explore and understand. These dragons could grow into beings capable of cooperation, strategy, and even innovation. Yet she could not ignore the risks. Flames, even small, could attract unwanted attention. Predators, scavengers, or even humans with less noble intentions might come seeking them. The orphanage, though safer now, was not yet secure. Alara had to think ahead, to imagine ways the dragons could protect themselves, to create defenses and strategies that relied on both human ingenuity and dragon instinct. The next morning, she began to plan. Using scraps from her shuttle old mechanical parts, and even lessons learned from the dragon's behavior, she began constructing simple defense systems: reflective panels, heat sensors, and alarm triggers that would alert her and the hatchlings to danger. She also devised exercises that encouraged the dragons to work together, using their flames in controlled bursts to manipulate objects or respond to threats. The hatchlings took to these exercises with enthusiasm. Cinder led the group, nudging Verdant and the others to respond correctly. They moved as a team, learning coordination and timing. Even the shyest hatchlings began to participate, drawn by the sense of accomplishment and the warmth of the Ember Core. By the end of the day, the orphanage was more than a place of warmth. It was a place of learning, growth, and preparation. The dragons were awakening not just physically, but mentally, discovering their abilities and beginning to understand the concept of cooperation and strategy. And Alara, a human engineer far from home, had become their guide, teacher, and protector. As the sun set behind the jagged peaks of Vayara, the Ember Core glowed softly, casting a golden halo over the chamber. The hatchlings gathered around it, curling together, breathing small flames that danced in the dim light. Outside, the highland winds continued to howl, indifferent to the life within the stone walls. But inside, the orphanage was alive with warmth, curiosity, and the sparks of intelligence that would one day carry them far beyond the frozen cliffs. Alara looked at the dragons, her heart full of hope and determination. The Ember Core had awakened their flames, but it had also awakened something deeper: the potential to learn, to trust, and to grow. The journey was far from over. Greater challenges awaited, dangers that could not be solved by warmth or flame alone. But for the first time in decades, the orphanage was alive and the dragons were awake. Hook for Part 4. The dragons had awakened, but the highlands held dangers beyond frost claws and harsh winds. Soon they would face threats that would test their intelligence, courage, and the trust they had learned to place in a human engineer. The highlands of Vayara were unforgiving, even as the sun rose behind jagged peaks. Snow glinted on sharp rocks, and icy gusts rattled the stone walls of the orphanage. For days, Alara had been preparing the hatchlings for challenges beyond their chambers, teaching them to coordinate, to focus their flames, and to respond to her signals. They were learning quickly, but she knew instinct alone would not protect them from every danger. She had not expected trouble so soon. From distant cliffs, she noticed movement, a shimmer of metal reflecting the weak sunlight. It was too precise, too deliberate to be natural predators. Her heart sank as recognition set in. Humans had found them, not the council or friendly explorers, but a mercenary syndicate. They sought dragons for profit, to capture and sell them for exotic markets, unaware or uncaring of the creatures' intelligence or welfare. Alara's mind raced. The orphanage was defenseless against their advanced weaponry, drones, rifles, and transport vehicles. She glanced at Cinder, who had become bolder over the past weeks. The red hatchling met her gaze, seemingly sensing her concern. Beside him, Verdant and the other hatchlings flinched at distant echoes, but their eyes shone with curiosity and determination. Together they had grown stronger, not just physically, but mentally. "Listen carefully," Alara said, moving to the center of the chamber. Her voice was calm but firm. "These humans are not here to help, they want to take you. You must stay close, follow my signals, and use your flames wisely. Do not panic, trust me." The hatchlings responded instinctively. Cinder nudged Verdant toward the Ember core, the device humming in acknowledgement. The core's warmth and pulse acted like a heartbeat, calming the dragons as Ilara mapped out a plan. Using the old shuttle parts and mechanical scraps she had saved, she quickly assembled simple devices, reflective panels, heat sensors, and small motion alarms, to alert them to approaching intruders. The first wave of mercenaries arrived mid-morning, their vehicles crunching over frozen stone. Drones hovered ahead, scanning for heat signatures. Ilara activated the Ember core's defense mode. It pulsed brighter, sending subtle heat signals that confused the drone's sensors. The dragons watched, wide-eyed but attentive, as she demonstrated the strategy. "Cinder, Verdant, this way," she whispered, guiding them toward a hidden passage she had reinforced with rocks and old shuttle panels. The other hatchlings followed, moving as a small, coordinated group. The drones approached, scanning for life, but the reflective panels and heat sensors created illusions, making it appear the hatchlings were elsewhere. Ilara felt a surge of pride. The dragons were not merely following her. They were thinking, reacting, and learning. When a Frostclaw predator stumbled upon the intruders, confused by the strange humans and their drones, the hatchlings instinctively moved closer to her, flames flickering, ready to respond. It was a dance of intelligence and instinct, one that relied on both human planning and dragon awareness. The mercenaries tried to adapt. Their drones hovered lower, their vehicles spreading across the cliffs to flush out the dragons. Ilara had anticipated this. Using the Ember core and small thermal mirrors she had arranged earlier, she created diversions, heat patterns on rocks, flickering pulses, and controlled smoke. The drones were misled, and the humans could not predict the dragons' movements. Cinder and Verdant began to take initiative. They learned to position themselves strategically, breathing controlled flames near sensors to trigger alarms or distract drones. Other hatchlings experimented with small bursts of fire, learning to manipulate objects, nudge rocks, and create simple barriers. It was not just defense, it was strategy. Ilara's guidance, combined with their instincts, allowed them to act as a cohesive unit. The mercenaries grew frustrated. Their technology was advanced, but it could not account for the combination of human ingenuity and dragon intelligence. Vehicles stalled on the uneven terrain, drones collided with reflective panels, and small traps they had not noticed were suddenly activated. Ilara observed, adjusting her signals, guiding the hatchlings with subtle hand gestures and voice cues. Each move was deliberate, measured, and synchronized. At one point, a drone hovered too close to Cinder, scanning the chamber with a bright light. Instinctively, Cinder released a controlled flame into the air, causing a spark that triggered the core's motion alarm. A panel above tilted, reflecting sunlight into the drone's sensors, and the machine faltered, spinning off course. The other hatchlings followed, each taking positions that created a network of obstacles, fire, and warmth to confuse the intruders. Ilara felt a surge of relief mixed with pride. The hatchlings were no longer merely surviving. They were cooperating, improvising, and thinking strategically. In weeks, they had transformed from fragile, timid creatures into beings capable of defending themselves, guided by the careful planning of a human who refused to see them as helpless. The mercenaries were forced to retreat. Their vehicles slid on icy slopes, and the drones, misled by the combination of technology and instinct, were damaged. The intruders' frustration was evident. They had underestimated the dragons and the ingenuity of the human who had awakened them. By the time they withdrew, the orphanage remained safe, the hatchlings unharmed. Ilara exhaled, leaning against a wall. The dragons circled her, flames flickering faintly as they settled into positions near the Ember core. Cinder nudged her gently, and Verdant brushed against her arm. They had learned not just to survive, but to cooperate and trust. They had become a team, and for the first time, Ilara felt that the orphanage could face future dangers with confidence. But she knew this victory was temporary. The mercenaries might return, stronger and better prepared. The highlands of Vayara were vast, and danger could arrive at any moment. Ilara began planning the next phase, creating a long-term safe haven, a place where the hatchlings could thrive without constant threat. She sketched ideas on her datapad, tunnels, barriers, and even plans for an orbital sanctuary where humans and dragons could coexist safely. The dragons watched her work, curious and attentive. Cinder tapped a small panel with his claw, as if offering a suggestion. Verdant nudged a reflective device toward the doorway. It was clear they were learning not just defense but problem-solving, strategy, and innovation. Human ingenuity had sparked intelligence within them, and now they were beginning to contribute to it themselves. That night the orphanage was quiet but alive. The ember core glowed softly, providing warmth and comfort. The hatchlings curled together, some resting, others lightly playing with the reflective panels and small mechanical toys Elara had left nearby. She sat among them, exhausted but content, knowing that the bonds they had formed were strong. Trust had been built, intelligence had been awakened, and survival had been ensured, for now. Outside, the highland winds continued to howl, indifferent to the life within the stone walls. But inside, the orphanage was alive with warmth, light, and the sparks of intelligence that would carry the hatchlings far beyond the cold cliffs. Elara looked at the dragons, her heart full of determination. She knew their journey was far from over. Greater threats awaited, predators, human hunters, and challenges she could not yet foresee. But for the first time, she was confident that her guidance, combined with the dragons' instinct and intelligence, could overcome them. In the silence of the night, she whispered softly, "You are ready, but we must be stronger. Together we will face what comes next." The dragons responded with small hisses, nudges, and flickers of flame, as if understanding the gravity of her words. They were no longer helpless hatchlings. They were learning to be defenders, problem-solvers, and companions. The ember core pulsed one last time for the night, a golden heartbeat in the center of the orphanage. It was a symbol of hope, guidance, and the power of ingenuity. The dragons were awakening not just to warmth, but to a life where they could grow, learn, and thrive. And Elara, a human engineer far from her home, had become the architect of that awakening, the guide who had shown them that intelligence, courage, and cooperation could overcome even the most dangerous challenges. Tomorrow would bring new tests, but tonight the orphanage stood victorious. The dragons had learned the power of trust, the importance of strategy, and the strength that came from working together. And somewhere in the cold highlands, the seeds of a future filled with ingenuity, courage, and hope had taken root, ready to grow into something extraordinary. Hook for Part 5. Though the orphanage had survived, the universe beyond Vayara would not leave them alone. Elara knew the time had come to think bigger, to build a safe haven that could withstand any threat and allow the dragons to grow into the beings they were meant to become. The highlands of Vayara stretched endlessly under a pale, icy sky. The orphanage, once cold and lifeless, now pulsed with warmth, life, and intelligence. The dragon hatchlings, Cinder, Verdant, and the others, had grown in strength, skill, and trust. But Elara knew that survival alone was no longer enough. The highlands were beautiful, but they were dangerous. Predators lurked in the shadows, and human intruders could return, more prepared than before. Elara had spent countless hours sketching and calculating, using every scrap of technology she had salvaged from her shuttle. Her plan was ambitious, almost unimaginable, an orbital sanctuary. Floating above Vayara, beyond the reach of predators, the winds, and mercenaries, it would be a place where humans and dragons could live safely together. Here, the hatchlings could grow into majestic creatures, free to explore, learn, and thrive. Building such a structure was no easy task. Elara scavenged every piece of her shuttle, repurposed old geothermal generators, and used her engineering knowledge to design modular habitats that could be lifted into orbit. The Ember Core became the prototype for environmental control systems, managing warmth, oxygen, and energy while responding to the dragon's needs. Each module was carefully calculated to ensure safety and comfort, with tunnels, chambers, and play areas for the hatchlings to explore. The dragons watched curiously as she worked. Cinder leaned over a panel, nudging a lever with his claw as if testing her designs. Verdant circled one of the smaller modules, sniffing and tapping it with a tiny snout. The other hatchlings tried to imitate, observing her movements and learning from her hands. They were no longer passive creatures. They were apprentices in ingenuity, learning the principles of engineering, physics, and coordination in ways that had once seemed impossible. Weeks passed. The orbital modules were constructed, piece by piece, and gradually assembled using a combination of human tools and dragon assistance. The dragons proved invaluable, carrying small components, operating simple mechanisms, and even igniting controlled flames to power auxiliary systems. Their intelligence, awakened and nurtured, had become a powerful tool. Where Alara had once relied solely on her ingenuity, she now had partners, creatures who could learn, adapt, and contribute. At last, the day came to launch the first module. Alara and the dragons worked together, following precise signals and careful coordination. Cinder and Verdant led the smaller hatchlings, demonstrating how to use wing movements and flame bursts to activate levers and release mechanisms safely. When the first module lifted off, propelled by a combination of controlled geothermal engines and magnetic thrusters, the hatchlings watched with awe. It rose steadily, orbiting the highlands like a golden jewel in the sky. The Ember Core guided the module, maintaining optimal warmth and energy flow. The dragons learned to navigate zero-gravity spaces, using their claws and wings to stabilize themselves. They played among the modules, testing the structures, exploring chambers, and discovering new areas of the sanctuary. Alara observed, amazed at their adaptability. These hatchlings had grown far beyond what she had imagined when she first arrived at the orphanage. Safety, however, was only one part of the plan. Alara wanted the dragons to continue learning, growing, and discovering their own potential. She designed interactive elements in the sanctuary, moving platforms, puzzle feeders, and obstacle courses that encouraged coordination, problem-solving, and control of their flames. The hatchlings adapted quickly, learning to use their intelligence to manipulate their environment and work together in ways that mirrored human ingenuity. Cinder emerged as a natural leader, coordinating small groups, guiding Verdant and the others, and even suggesting small improvements to Alara's designs. Verdant, though more cautious, excelled in observation and precision, mastering complex tasks that required careful timing and attention to detail. The other hatchlings developed their own skills, some in coordination, others in exploration or flame control. Together, they formed a cooperative society within the sanctuary, each contributing to the growth and safety of the group. The orbital sanctuary became more than a safe haven, it became a home. Alara watched the dragons play among the modules, flames flickering in controlled bursts, wings stretching freely in zero gravity, eyes bright with curiosity and intelligence. She realized that the Ember Core had done more than provide warmth or guidance. It had awakened potential, intelligence, curiosity, and the desire to learn. Humanity had provided the spark, and the dragons had taken it further, creating a partnership that could achieve wonders. One evening, as the modules orbited silently above Viara, Alara reflected on the journey. She remembered the first days in the cold chambers, the trembling hatchlings, and the desperation in their eyes. Now those same creatures had grown into capable, intelligent beings, capable of thinking, learning, and cooperating in ways that rivaled some of the humans who had once sought to exploit them. The orphanage had transformed from a place of fear and cold into a thriving ecosystem of life, curiosity, and innovation. Alara knew this was only the beginning. The universe beyond Viara would not remain idle. Predators, explorers, and potential threats existed on countless worlds, but she was no longer alone. The dragons, guided by intelligence, trust, and cooperation, were capable of defending themselves and their home. And together, they could adapt, innovate, and overcome challenges that might once have seemed insurmountable. The first wave of human explorers arrived months later, cautious and curious. They expected to find fragile hatchlings, defenseless creatures, and a struggling engineer. Instead, they found a thriving sanctuary orbiting a frozen planet. Dragons moving confidently among modular chambers, coordinating tasks, and even assisting in minor operations of the sanctuary. The explorers watched in awe, realizing that this was not simply survival. It was growth, intelligence, and cooperation on a scale they had not imagined. Alara introduced them to the dragons carefully, showing the trust and communication they had developed. Cinder and Verdant led the hatchlings, demonstrating gestures, flame bursts, and signals that the humans could follow. The explorers quickly understood that these dragons were not pets or tools, they were partners. And in that understanding, a new relationship between humans and dragons was born, one based on respect, intelligence, and collaboration rather than exploitation. As the orbital sanctuary expanded, additional modules were launched and assembled. Each module had a purpose, some for play, others for learning, observation, or rest. Thermal cores, powered by Ember core technology, regulated temperature and energy, while interactive systems encouraged intelligence and cooperation. The dragons explored freely, learning the rules of their environment, solving problems, and even teaching each other. Alara watched them with pride. Humanity had often been defined by its ingenuity, but now she realized that ingenuity could be shared, adapted, and multiplied. The dragons, awakened by warmth and guidance, were more than creatures. They were collaborators, thinkers, and problem solvers. Together, humans and dragons had created something that neither could achieve alone. Months turned into years. The hatchlings grew into majestic dragons, each displaying unique talents and skills. Some excelled in coordination, others in exploration or flame control. Cinder, now fully grown, became a guardian of the sanctuary, leading patrols and assisting in training younger dragons. Verdant, equally strong and intelligent, focused on precision tasks, monitoring systems and guiding hatchlings in learning exercises. Together, they maintained balance, safety, and the ongoing growth of the sanctuary. Alara continued to innovate. She developed new Ember core systems for energy, warmth, and guidance, integrating feedback from the dragons themselves. Their input, through observation and interaction, allowed her to refine designs in ways that human ingenuity alone could not have achieved. It was a partnership in the truest sense, human creativity guided by dragon intelligence, learning, and instinct. The orbital sanctuary became a symbol across Vayara and beyond, a testament to the power of cooperation, intelligence, and empathy. Humans visiting the sanctuary marveled at the dragons' abilities, understanding that this was not simply a collection of creatures, but a thriving ecosystem of learning, growth, and innovation. The dragons themselves had grown beyond instinct, displaying problem-solving, coordination, and trust that could rival many human teams. One quiet night, as the modules orbited the icy planet below, Alara watched the dragons resting near the Ember core. Flames flickered softly, controlled and calm, casting golden light across the chambers. Cinder curled near her, Verdant beside him, and the other dragons nestled comfortably around warmth cores and interactive devices. The sanctuary, once a dream born from desperation, was now a reality, a home, a school, and a fortress all in one. Alara reflected on the journey. The dragons had known fear, cold, and abandonment. They had once been fragile and trembling, uncertain of their place in the world. Now they were confident, intelligent, and thriving. And it had not been just warmth or survival that changed them. It was guidance, patience, trust, and the spark of human ingenuity that had awakened their potential. The highlands of Vayara, once harsh and unforgiving, now seemed distant and irrelevant. The sanctuary floated above, a beacon of life, intelligence, and cooperation. The dragons had found more than warmth. They had found purpose, confidence, and the ability to grow beyond the limitations of instinct alone. And Alara, far from home, had become the architect of their future, the human who had shown that creativity, empathy, and courage could change the fate of a species. The universe beyond waited, full of challenges, opportunities, and unknown dangers. But Alara knew the dragons were ready. Together, they could explore, learn, and thrive. Together, they had proven that intelligence, ingenuity, and trust could overcome even the coldest cliffs, the fiercest predators, and the harshest challenges. Humanity had sparked the flame, but the dragons had taken it further, turning it into a living fire that would burn bright for generations to come. And high above Vayara, in the warmth and light of human and dragon collaboration, the orphanage, once cold and abandoned, had become a home beyond stars, a testament to what could be achieved when different beings worked together toward a shared dream.